The tunnel entrance remained clear, even as 4 feet of new snow buried every cabin door in the settlement. Elias Drummond crawled through the log-reinforced passage beneath the frozen earth, emerging inside his warm cabin, while 3 trappers a mile away remained sealed in their shelters for the 6th day, rationing firewood and wondering if they would survive until the thaw. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of frontier innovation like this one inspire you, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale is even more remarkable than this one. The winter of 1841 arrived early in the Colorado Rockies. Snow fell in October, heavy wet storms that blanketed the high valleys where trappers had established their seasonal camps. Elias Drummond had seen harsh winters before during his 9 years in the mountains, but this season brought something different. The snow came in waves, each storm depositing 2 or 3 feet, then pausing, just long enough for the surface to melt slightly before temperatures dropped and froze everything solid. By late November, many cabins sat beneath snow accumulation that reached halfway up their walls. Martin Greer lived alone in a cabin 2 miles from Elias's camp, working a trap line along a creek that fed into the larger river system. Martin was competent and experienced, a trapper who had survived 6 winters and knew how to manage the dangers of mountain life. His cabin was typical construction for the era. Logs notched at corners, a single door facing south to catch maximum sunlight, 1 small window, and a pitched roof designed to shed snow. He had built it in 5 days the previous summer. It was adequate shelter, or so everyone believed. The blizzard struck on December 3rd. Snow fell continuously for 36 hours, driven by winds that created drifts 8 and 10 feet deep in places where terrain funneled the accumulation. When the storm finally cleared, the temperature dropped to levels that made exposed skin freeze in minutes. Martin's cabin door, which opened outward as most cabin doors did, was completely buried beneath a drift that had formed against the south-facing wall. Inside, Martin had firewood for perhaps 10 days if he burned it carefully. He had dried meat and basic supplies, but he had no way to exit. The door was packed solid, with snow compressed by wind into a density that approached ice. He tried pushing against it, using all his strength and body weight. The door moved perhaps an inch before the packed snow stopped it completely. He tried digging at the edges with a knife, but the gap between door and frame was too narrow to make progress. After 2 hours of effort, he accepted the reality. He was trapped until the snow melted or someone dug him out. Elias found him 6 days later. He had been checking on neighboring trappers after the storm, a practice born from years of experience with mountain winters. When he reached Martin's cabin and saw the buried door, he immediately understood what had happened. It took him 3 hours to dig through the drift, the snow having frozen into layers that required chopping with a hatchet in places. When he finally cleared the door enough to open it, Martin was weak from reduced rations and the psychological strain of entrapment. He had burned through most of his firewood trying to stay warm while wondering if anyone would come. They sat in the cabin that evening, and Martin spoke with unusual intensity about the experience. Not the physical discomfort or the fear exactly, but the helplessness. The realization that his shelter, the structure meant to protect him, had become a trap. That a natural weather event could seal him inside with no possibility of escape regardless of his skill or strength or preparation. Elias listened carefully. Something about Martin's words settled into his mind with uncomfortable weight, and he found himself unable to stop, thinking about cabin doors and snow and the fundamental vulnerability of how mountain men built their shelters. Over the following weeks, Elias visited other trappers scattered throughout the valley system. What he discovered troubled him. Martin's situation was not unique. It was routine. Nearly every trapper had stories of being sealed inside their cabins for days at a time during heavy snow years. They spoke about it casually, as if entrapment was simply another hardship to accept like cold or hunger or the constant threat of bear encounters. Henry Caldwell, an experienced mountain man who had trapped for 15 years, laughed when Elias brought up the topic. He described winters where he had been sealed in for weeks, emerging only when spring thaw finally melted the accumulated snow enough to force the door open. He treated it as an inevitable aspect of mountain life, something to prepare for by stockpiling extra firewood and food. The possibility of changing the situation never seemed to occur to him. William Ashford had tried modifications. He had built his cabin door to open inward rather than outward, reasoning that he could push snow away from inside. But inward opening doors created their own problems. Snow that did enter the cabin during opening had nowhere to go. The door took up interior space. And when deep drifts formed, the pressure against the door from outside made it impossible to open regardless of which direction it swung. Robert Finch had attempted a different solution. He built his doorway 4 feet above ground level, requiring a log step to enter. The elevated entrance did reduce snow accumulation directly against the door. But during heavy snow years, drifts still reached the threshold, and the elevated entrance created hazards when ice formed on the step or when carrying supplies in and out of the cabin. The more Elias investigated, the clearer the pattern became. Every solution focused on the door itself, making it stronger, changing its orientation, elevating its position. But all these approaches shared a fundamental assumption that the door needed to be at surface level, accessible from the outside ground. Nobody questioned that assumption. They simply tried to make surface-level access more resistant to snow accumulation. What made the problem especially dangerous was not the initial snow burial. Most trappers could survive days or even weeks sealed inside if they had adequate supplies. The real threat came from the freeze-thaw cycles that characterized mountain winters. A storm would deposit heavy snow. Then a warming trend would melt the surface layers. Then temperatures would drop again, turning that melted snow into solid ice. This cycle repeated throughout winter, each repetition adding another layer of ice to the previous accumulation. By midwinter, cabin doors were not just buried in snow. They were sealed behind ice barriers inches thick, ice that had formed in layers over weeks or months. Digging through powder snow was difficult. Chopping through layered ice was exhausting and time-consuming. Some trappers sealed in their cabins during late winter faced ice barriers that required an entire day of work to penetrate from outside. Elias spent the remainder of that winter thinking about the problem with an intensity that surprised him. He was not an educated man. He had learned basic carpentry and construction from practical experience. But he understood something fundamental. If every solution people tried focused on the same approach, perhaps the approach itself was wrong. Spring arrived in April of 1842, and Elias left the mountains briefly to sell his winter's collection of furs in Denver. The settlement was growing rapidly, transforming from a rough mining camp into something approaching a permanent town. While conducting his business, Elias found himself drawn to construction sites where buildings were going up with surprising sophistication for frontier architecture. He watched carpenters framing structures, noting how they distributed weight and reinforced weak points. He observed stonemasons building foundations that extended below ground level to prevent frost heave. But what captured his attention most intensely was a mining operation on the outskirts of town where men were sinking a shaft into hillside terrain to reach a silver vein. The miners had excavated a tunnel that extended 30 feet into the earth. Elias spent an afternoon watching them work, asking questions about how they prevented collapse and managed water seepage. The foreman, a man named Patterson who had worked mines in Pennsylvania before coming west, explained the principles of tunnel construction with surprising patience. Support timbers placed at regular intervals, horizontal bracing to contain lateral earth pressure, roof beams sized to handle the compression load from above, drainage channels to divert groundwater away from the work area. Something clicked in Elias's mind as he listened. Tunnels went through earth, beneath the surface. Snow accumulated at surface level. Ground below the surface maintained relatively stable temperature even during winter. If a cabin could be accessed from below ground level, snow accumulation would be irrelevant. The idea seemed obvious once it formed, yet Elias knew he had never heard of anyone attempting it. Mountain men built cabins with surface-level doors because that was how cabins were built. The possibility of underground access had simply never been considered, or if considered, had been dismissed as impractical. Elias returned to his mountain camp in late May with his mind consumed by the concept. He spent weeks observing his own cabin and the land around it, thinking through the technical challenges: where to position a tunnel entrance, how deep to excavate to stay below the snow line but above the water table, how to reinforce the tunnel to prevent collapse, how to integrate it with his existing cabin structure. The more he analyzed the problem, the more convinced he became that underground access solved every issue that plagued surface doors. Snow could accumulate to any depth without affecting a tunnel entrance positioned 3 or 4 feet below ground level. Freeze-thaw cycles happened at the surface where temperature fluctuated. Underground, temperature remained more stable. A properly constructed tunnel would provide access regardless of surface conditions. In early June, Elias began marking out where he would dig. He chose a location on the north side of his cabin where prevailing winds were less likely to create deep drifts. He gathered tools, sharpened his spades and picks, and started collecting logs that would serve as reinforcement timbers. Henry Caldwell visited during these preparations and asked what Elias was planning. When Elias explained the tunnel concept, Henry stared at him in silence for a long moment, then laughed so hard he had to sit down. The idea of digging underneath a cabin to create an entrance struck him as the most absurd thing he had heard in 15 years of mountain living. Elias began excavation in mid-June, when the ground had thawed completely from winter frost. He started by digging a trench parallel to his cabin's north wall, working inward from a point 8 feet away from the foundation. The trench was 4 feet wide, giving him room to work and install reinforcement. He dug carefully, removing soil in layers and piling it systematically where it would not interfere with construction. The first challenge emerged within days. At 18 inches depth, he encountered a layer of dense clay that resisted his spade and required picking to break through. The clay was heavy and sticky, clinging to his tools and making progress exhausting. But Elias recognized that clay also meant good news for tunnel stability. Clay held its shape better than loose soil and was less prone to sudden collapse. By the end of the Dua, first week, he had excavated a trench 3 feet deep and 6 feet long, angling toward his cabin foundation. The work was brutal. Every shovelful of earth had to be lifted out of an increasingly deep hole. His back ached constantly. His hands developed blisters that broke and bled, then calloused over. But he continued methodically, measuring depth regularly to ensure he maintained consistent grade. Water presented the second major challenge. A spring rain in late June filled his excavation with 8 inches of muddy water overnight. Elias spent an entire day bailing the trench and digging drainage channels to divert runoff away from his work site. He realized that any tunnel system would need permanent drainage, or it would flood during every rain and snowmelt. He dug a shallow channel along one side of his trench, sloping it away from the cabin so water would flow out rather than pooling inside. The third challenge was structural. As the trench deepened past 3 feet, the walls began showing signs of instability. Small collapses occurred where soil slumped inward. Elias understood he could not simply dig an open tunnel and hope it remained stable. He needed reinforcement installed progressively as he excavated deeper. He adapted principles he had seen at the mining operation. He cut logs to serve as wall supports, selecting straight timber approximately 8 inches in diameter. These logs would be placed horizontally along the trench walls, stacked to create rigid barriers that contained the earth. But unlike a surface cabin where logs could be stacked freely, underground logs needed to be braced against lateral pressure from surrounding soil. Elias designed a system using vertical support posts. He would sink these posts into the trench floor at 4-foot intervals, creating upright anchors. Then he would stack horizontal logs between the posts, with each log resting against the verticals. The posts would prevent the horizontal logs from being pushed inward by earth pressure. Finally, he would install roof logs spanning from one wall to the other, supported by the vertical posts and creating a protected ceiling. The engineering was simple in concept, but demanded precision in execution. Every measurement mattered. Posts needed to be truly vertical, or they would fail under load. Horizontal logs needed tight fit against both the posts and the earth behind them. Roof logs required sufficient diameter to handle compression from above without bending or breaking. The installation of the first vertical support post took an entire morning. Elias dug a hole 2 feet deep into the trench floor, positioned the log vertically, and packed soil around its base in layers, tamping each layer until it was compressed solid. He used a plumb line, a simple weight on a string, to ensure the post stood perfectly vertical. Even a few degrees of lean would compromise the structure's ability to bear weight. With the first post secured, he began installing horizontal wall logs. He had stripped the bark from each log using a draw knife, creating smooth surfaces that would fit tightly together. The first horizontal log was positioned against the earth wall with one end touching the vertical post. Elias packed soil behind it, forcing it firmly against the post face. Then he added a second horizontal log above the first, fitting them together as closely as possible. The stacking process was slow. Each log weighed 60 to 80 pounds and had to be maneuvered into position within the confined trench space. Elias worked alone, using leverage and careful positioning rather than brute strength. He would roll a log to the trench edge, lower one end into the excavation, then work the log down until it rested in position. Some logs required trimming with an axe where irregularities prevented tight fitting. After installing 4 horizontal logs on one side, creating a wall 2 feet high, Elias dug and installed the second vertical post 4 feet from the first. Then he began the opposite wall, mirroring the process. The parallel walls gradually took shape, containing the earth on both sides while creating a clear passage between them. The roof installation required different techniques. Elias cut logs 10 inches in diameter, thicker than the wall logs, because they would bear the full weight of earth and snow above. He notched the ends of each roof log so they would sit securely atop the vertical posts, creating a mechanical connection that prevented sliding. The first roof log was positioned spanning between the posts, connecting the 2 walls. Getting the roof logs into position while working in a trench 4 feet deep tested Elias's ingenuity. He built a simple ramp using planks, allowing him to roll the heavy logs down into the trench at a controlled angle. Then he used a lever arrangement, a long pole positioned under the log with a rock as fulcrum point, to lift one end high enough to rest on the post top. The other end could then be pivoted up and positioned. Once the first section was complete, 4 feet of tunnel with walls and roof fully installed, Elias extended his excavation forward another 4 feet. He installed another vertical post, added more horizontal wall logs, and positioned another roof log. The tunnel grew in sections, each one structurally complete, before he proceeded to the next. William Ashford visited in July and stood at the edge of the excavation, watching Elias work. He shook his head slowly and commented that this was the most elaborate grave a man had ever dug for himself. Elias did not respond. He simply continued fitting logs. By late July, Elias had extended the tunnel 12 feet from its entrance point and was approaching his cabin foundation. The structure behind him demonstrated the principles that made the system work. The 3-part reinforcement, horizontal walls, vertical supports, and roof logs functioned as an integrated unit where each component depended on the others. The horizontal wall logs contained lateral earth pressure. Soil naturally pushed inward against any excavation, trying to fill the void. The stacked logs created rigid barriers that resisted this pressure. But logs alone would eventually bow inward under sustained load. That was where the vertical support posts became critical. They acted as braces, preventing the horizontal logs from deflecting. The posts transferred horizontal pressure downward into the ground, converting a force that would cause collapse into a force that simply compressed soil beneath the posts. The roof logs served multiple functions. Obviously, they prevented earth and snow from falling into the tunnel, but they also tied the 2 walls together structurally. Each roof log connected the vertical posts on opposite walls, creating a frame that kept the walls from spreading apart. The weight of earth above the roof logs actually helped stabilize the structure through compression. As long as the roof logs were strong enough to bear the load without breaking, the weight pressing down helped lock everything in place. Elias had observed similar principles in stone arch construction during his time in Denver. An arch carried weight by converting downward pressure into lateral thrust against the arch supports. His tunnel used the same physics. The roof logs acted like a horizontal arch, with vertical posts serving as the supporting pillars. The difference was that his structure used compression and friction rather than complex curves to achieve stability. The spacing of vertical posts was critical. Elias had settled on 4-foot intervals through experimentation. Posts closer together would provide more support but require more materials and labor. Posts farther apart would save effort but risk roof logs bending or breaking under load. 4 feet represented the optimal balance for logs of the diameter he was using. Between the horizontal wall logs, Elias packed a mixture of clay and small stones. This chinking served several purposes. It filled gaps that would otherwise allow soil to sift through. It created a smooth interior wall surface, and it helped distribute pressure evenly across the logs rather than creating point loads where irregularities existed. The drainage channel he had installed along one side of the tunnel floor proved essential. Rain in early August demonstrated its value. Water seeped through the earth above and trickled down the walls, but instead of pooling in the tunnel, it flowed along the channel and drained out the entrance. Elias had sloped the entire tunnel floor slightly, just a few inches over its 12-foot length, ensuring water moved away from the cabin rather than toward it. Ventilation was another consideration. The tunnel would need air circulation to prevent dampness and ensure breathability if he spent time inside. Elias positioned the entrance facing prevailing winds, allowing natural air movement to sweep through the passage. The temperature inside the tunnel remained noticeably cooler than surface temperature, typically 10 to 15 degrees lower, a natural consequence of being surrounded by earth. The final stage of construction involved connecting the tunnel to his cabin interior. Elias carefully removed a section of the lowest logs on his cabin's north wall, creating an opening 30 inches wide and 24 inches high. The opening was positioned at floor level inside the cabin but opened into the tunnel at a point where the passage was still 3 feet below exterior ground surface. He reinforced the cabin wall around this opening using additional vertical posts inside the cabin itself, ensuring that removing the wall section did not compromise the cabin's structural integrity. Then he built a door for the tunnel entrance, a thick plank construction similar to his cabin's main door but sized to fit the smaller opening. The door was hinged on the interior and could be barred from inside the cabin, providing security while allowing quick access to the tunnel when needed. At the exterior tunnel entrance, 8 feet from the cabin, Elias constructed an entrance structure that would remain accessible even under heavy snow. He built up the sides using stacked logs, creating walls that extended 18 inches above ground level. These walls funneled into the tunnel entrance like a chimney in reverse. The roof over this entrance section was particularly robust, using logs 12 inches in diameter to support what would become substantial snow load. Inside this entrance structure, Elias created storage space for firewood. The protected area could hold a week's worth of fuel, accessible even during the worst weather. He also installed a simple ladder, 3 thick rungs attached to the vertical posts, allowing easy descent into the tunnel from ground level. The entire construction had consumed 6 weeks of intensive labor. Elias had worked nearly every daylight hour, with breaks only, for necessary tasks like hunting and maintaining his trap lines. His hands bore permanent calluses from shovel and axe handles. His back had adapted to the constant strain of lifting and positioning heavy logs. He had moved approximately 8 tons of earth and installed 43 logs of various sizes into the tunnel structure. September brought the first signs of approaching winter. Temperatures dropped at night, creating frost on grass by morning. Elias spent these weeks stockpiling firewood, processing meat from a deer he had killed, and preparing his cabin for months of cold. He filled the tunnel entrance storage area with split wood, stacking it carefully to maximize capacity. Robert Finch stopped by in late September and asked to see the completed tunnel. Elias showed him through the system, pointing out the reinforcement structure and explaining the drainage design. Robert listened politely, but his expression remained skeptical. He commented that Elias had spent an entire summer building something that might never be necessary. A mild winter would make the whole effort pointless. Elias acknowledged this possibility, but did not seem troubled by it. He had built the tunnel not for one specific winter, but for the inevitable season when conditions would make it essential. Whether that season arrived this year or 5 years from now mattered less than having the solution in place when needed. The winter of 1842 began quietly. November brought moderate snowfall, accumulations of 6 to 8 inches that melted partially between storms. December continued the pattern. By the end of the year, snow depth around cabins was manageable, perhaps 2 feet in most areas. Trappers went about their work normally, checking lines and processing pelts. Some made jokes about Elias's unnecessary tunnel sitting unused while everyone else accessed their cabins through regular doors without difficulty. January brought change. A storm system moved into the Rockies on the 8th and settled over the high valleys like a stationary siege engine. Snow fell continuously for 3 days, heavy wet flakes that accumulated at a rate of 2 inches per hour during peak intensity. When the storm finally cleared on January 11th, over 5 feet of new snow blanketed the region. The temperature dropped immediately after the storm. Clear skies and Arctic air sent thermometers to 20 below zero. The snow that had fallen wet and heavy froze solid. Then, 4 days later, a warming trend arrived. Daytime temperatures rose above freezing, melting the surface layer of snow into slush. Nighttime temperatures dropped again, refreezing the slush into a hard crust. This cycle repeated. Melt during the day, freeze at night. Each cycle added another layer of ice to the existing snowpack. By late January, cabin doors throughout the valley were not just buried, but sealed behind ice barriers that had formed in layers. Trappers who had dug themselves out after the initial storm found themselves trapped again as ice formed overnight. They would spend hours chopping through the ice, clearing their doorways, only to have the next melt-freeze cycle seal them in again. Elias experienced none of this. His tunnel entrance, positioned 3 feet below original ground level, remained accessible throughout. The entrance structure he had built extended above the snow, and the vertical descent into the tunnel meant accumulated snow simply sat on the roof logs he had installed. He descended the ladder, walked through his reinforced passage, and entered his cabin through the interior door. The system worked exactly as he had envisioned. Charles Brennan discovered this during a visit in early February. He had spent 2 days digging out his own cabin after being sealed in, then traveled to check on other trappers. When he reached Elias's location and saw the tunnel entrance clear while snow buried everything else, he initially could not understand what he was seeing. Elias emerged from the tunnel carrying firewood from the entrance storage, walking normally, while Charles stood in snow up to his thighs. Charles descended into the tunnel and examined the construction with careful attention. He touched the horizontal logs, tested the vertical supports, looked at the roof structure bearing tons of snow without sagging. He asked detailed questions about excavation depth, log sizing, and drainage design. When he emerged, his skepticism had transformed into something else entirely. He asked if Elias would help him build a similar system at his own cabin. The winter continued its pattern of storms, followed by melt-freeze cycles through February and into March. Elias maintained continuous access to his shelter while other trappers struggled with repeated entrapment. Spring arrived late in 1843. Snow persisted into April, finally melting enough by mid-month to allow travel between camps. Trappers emerged from a winter that had been notably harsh even by mountain standards. Several had burned through their entire firewood supplies and resorted to breaking up furniture for fuel. 2 trappers had abandoned their cabins entirely during February, hiking out to Denver rather than endure further entrapment. Martin Greer visited Elias in early May and asked directly if Elias would teach him the tunnel construction technique. Martin had been sealed in his cabin 4 separate times during the winter, each incident lasting between 3 and 7 days. The psychological strain of repeated entrapment had affected him more than the physical hardship. He wanted a solution that would prevent him from ever experiencing that helplessness again. Elias agreed and spent 2 weeks helping Martin excavate and build a tunnel system at his cabin site. The process went faster, with 2 men working. They completed the excavation in 5 days and had the reinforcement structure installed within another week. Martin learned the principles as they worked: the importance of vertical post placement, the need for drainage channels, the proper sizing of roof logs to handle snow load. Charles Brennan began his own tunnel construction in June, working alone but following the design Elias had shown him. He made modifications based on his specific site conditions. His cabin sat on rockier ground that made excavation more difficult but provided better natural drainage. He adjusted the tunnel depth to accommodate the rock layer, going slightly shallower but compensating with a more robust entrance structure. Word spread through the scattered trapping community during the summer of 1843. When trappers gathered at trading posts or encountered each other along trails, conversation frequently turned to the previous winter's hardships and the tunnel solution that had allowed Elias to avoid them. Some remained skeptical, viewing the construction effort as excessive. But others, particularly those who had suffered most during winter entrapment, began planning their own versions. By fall, 7 trappers in the valley system had built or were building foundation-level tunnel access to their cabins. Each design varied slightly based on individual circumstances and available materials. William Ashford, who had mocked the concept initially, built a shorter tunnel only 6 feet long, but excavated it 4 feet deep to ensure it stayed well below the snow line. Daniel Whitmore built an elaborate entrance structure with a covered roof that created a small sheltered area at the tunnel mouth. The phrase Drummond Tunnel entered casual usage, though Elias never encouraged the attribution. Trappers would mention they were building a Drummond Tunnel or ask if someone had added underground access to their cabin yet. The specific terminology varied, but the concept itself had become recognized as a legitimate solution to a problem that had plagued mountain dwellers for decades. The winter of 1843 to 1844 was milder than the previous year, reducing the immediate validation of the technique. But those who had built tunnels appreciated the psychological benefit even without extreme conditions. They knew they had eliminated a vulnerability regardless of whether any particular winter tested it severely. The technique continued spreading through the 1840s and into the 1850s as mountain men shared knowledge through the informal networks that connected remote camps. Trappers who had never met Elias Drummond built tunnel systems based on descriptions from others who had seen his original construction. The designs evolved and adapted to different terrain and conditions, but the core principles remained consistent. Access positioned below the snow accumulation zone, reinforcement using the 3-part log system, and drainage to prevent water problems. The practical advantages extended beyond emergency access during extreme weather. Tunnels provided protected storage for firewood and supplies that remained dry and accessible regardless of surface conditions. They offered escape routes if cabins caught fire or faced other emergencies. In regions where hostile encounters occurred, some trappers modified their tunnels to serve as defensive positions or concealed exits. Documentation of lives saved by tunnel access is incomplete because survival often went unrecorded. But accounts from the period include references to trappers weathering severe storms that would have been fatal in traditionally constructed cabins. A particularly brutal winter in 1849 trapped many settlers and trappers for extended periods. Those with underground access survived with relative normalcy, while others faced genuine survival crises. The decline of the mountain man era in the 1850s did not end the technique's usefulness. Homesteaders moving into high-altitude regions discovered abandoned cabins with tunnel systems and recognized their value. Some maintained and improved these structures. Others built new cabins, incorporating foundation-level access from the start. The principle spread beyond the original trapping community into broader frontier construction practice in snow-prone regions. Military outposts in mountain territories sometimes adopted similar approaches for critical structures. Supply depots and ammunition storage facilities built in the 1860s occasionally featured underground access that ensured continuous availability of essential materials regardless of weather conditions. The connection back to Elias's original innovation was indirect and likely unknown to those implementing it, but the problem-solving logic was identical. Elias himself left the mountains in 1851. The fur trade had collapsed years earlier, and he had transitioned to guiding settlers and prospectors through mountain passes. He had saved money over his years in the wilderness and invested it in a small ranch in western Colorado near the town of Grand Junction. He married in 1853 a widow named Catherine who had come west with her family. They had 2 children and lived quietly, farming and raising cattle. He rarely spoke about his trapping years or the tunnel construction technique he had developed. To his family and neighbors, he was simply a rancher who had once worked in the mountains. When he died in 1876 at age 64, his obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of innovations or frontier engineering. It noted only that he had been a respected member of the community and a veteran of the mountain trade. But in the high valleys of the Colorado Rockies, cabins with foundation-level tunnel access still stood, weathered but functional, protecting new inhabitants from the same winter conditions that had threatened trappers decades earlier.